So why don't we go ahead and get started. Thanks for taking the time to come to the Investing in Students panel. For those of you who thought this was the panel moderated by Will I Am, my name is Will I Am Not. And just so you don't all go running and looking, his panel is over at the Beverly Wilshire, so don't even bother getting up at this point. So great topic, want to jump into it. And one thing that struck me, my real name is Sean Green, I'm a pinch hit moderator. And as either Ben or Jerry once said in talking about their experience prior to founding Ben & Jerry's, they were unencumbered by the burden of prior experience. So I am not the expert, I'm just the troublemaker moderator, these guys are. But one thing that struck me in the topic was every venture capitalist I've ever talked to always would say the exact same thing. You know, I don't invest in companies, I invest in people. Well, the topic of this panel literally is innovative, new, disruptive platforms that literally create opportunities to invest in people. So you guys have all got the document with everybody's bio. We won't dive into that, but let's jump into it right away and kick it off with Mike Cagney, CEO and founder of Social Finance. So Mike, first question is, innovative new model that you're pioneering. What's in it for the student? If you can, let's start by grounding everybody with, how does your model work and how does a student benefit from working with you?
Sure, and I'll do that by talking a little bit about the model very quickly. So effectively, we're a community-based marketplace, and one of the things that we do is we connect alumni and students in a medium that allows for both the financing of student loans and the refinancing of student loans for folks who graduate. And the value proposition there is threefold, in that one, we're doing these at rates below their comparable alternatives, whether it's federal or private government rates. So our average borrower is saving about $9,000 to do a refinancing with us. Two, we're delivering job support. So we've had 28 borrowers lose their jobs as SoFi members. We've gone out and basically gotten them reemployed through our career services group, through the network of investors and other borrowers that we have. And three is on the entrepreneurial side. So we have a formal entrepreneur program. We've had 19 borrowers who have started companies and got seed financing for those businesses, again, from the community. So the thesis is it's an ecosystem that you're keeping capital local. You're keeping it engaged with things that you're interested in, that you care about. The value proposition or the trade-off to the borrower is if they're stepping out of a federal loan, they're giving up certain guaranteed protections, things like income-based repayment. We do that for our borrowers, but it's not an explicit guarantee. Economic hardship forbearance, we also actually explicitly guarantee that, but not for the 3 years that the federal government does. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but it's one where folks who have a reasonably good idea about their career or their trajectory are very excited to engage on. And we've done over $500 million of student loan refinancing at this point. We're doing right now about $100 million a month. So we're the second largest peer-to-peer lender in the marketplace, and excited about the opportunity ahead of us.
Fantastic. And I should have said up front that part of the goal is to keep the conversation moving really quickly. So I had asked the speakers to keep their comments to 1 minute or 90 seconds. Mike, thank you for leading off with the behavior perfectly. I do have yellow cards that I will give to people if they go over time.
That means he punches you in the arm.
So. Well, I asked Milton, can we give electric shocks if people go too long, but they veto that idea. So Dave Gerard, CEO and founder of Upstart, another innovative platform. Same question, can you tell folks a little bit about your model and how does the borrower benefit from working with Upstart?
Sure. So I left Google 2 years ago with some colleagues to found Upstart, really based on an observation that a lot of people graduate from college wanting to be entrepreneurs. Millennials tend to want to go in that direction, but are held back from doing so because they have a lot of student debt. Student debt sort of forces you down a path of being able to reliably service that debt. And the idea around Upstart was, could we convert that to something more equity-like that would allow them to take the risk that they want to take? So Upstart really is a lending platform where in our first product, you actually can receive money today as the borrower and pay it back not as a fixed interest rate, but as a fraction of what you earn over a period of years, with the fundamental value proposition being when you don't earn, you don't pay. And the design around this notion of an income share product is that it sidesteps the principal cause of default in loans, which is unemployment or disruption in income, because it's designed to always be affordable. So that product we launched a year ago. We've just launched a simple traditional loan product as well, really with the recognition that millennials really are underserved by the financial services industry and have a real challenges in accessing capital. But that's the heart of our model is funding for young people on fair and reasonable terms, which we think is a very fundamental sort of necessary thing in the economy today.
Fantastic. And turn it to Bob Whelan again with the same question, Bob, who runs 13th Street Funding. Your model is a little bit different, and your corporate form is a little bit different.
It is, yes, in two respects. Number one, we don't use the word loan or lending. We make equity investments in students. And number two, we're a nonprofit. We were 501c3 back in 2009. So from the student's perspective, what's the basic deal? We're making, through a contract, a 15-year investment in a student's income potential, so that they graduate from college, they earn income, and they make over $18,000 a year. They will begin to repay the obligation at 5% of their income. So if they make less than 18, they pay nothing. If they make over 18,000, if they make $1 million, it's still 5%. That's the basic financial deal. We've also pooled all of these different contracts, if you will, into a cohort. So all of the students begin to get a sense that they're in it together. It's kind of a joint and several obligation, if you will, which is not legally technically accurate, but they are pooled. So they immediately begin to have the sense of community. That as a jumping point really gets to the second foundational principle we have with our program, and that is we formed another entity that actually enters into the relationship with the student and aggregates the students from a financial point of view. But we try to get the students to think differently about this club that they actually own. They have a governance oversight to the club. One of the cohort members is actually on the board of this club. We try to get them to think about, well, how can the club help you in your life and with your career? And that's really where the big differentiators come. I'll give you an example. A lot of the conversations, and we funded 11 students, by the way, so it's all early. We're still proving. But the students all have great career aspirations, but they have no mentors in their lives. They have no idea. These are really first generation English as a second language. So they have no mentors, but they've got great career aspirations. So one of the things we've thought about, and I've talked to the AARP, is actually connecting these mentors to the students as they go through their careers and career changes, because they're all going to change their aspirations, I'm sure. So you got a financial deal, but the real secret to the sauce is this concept of club and community.
Fantastic. So David Bergeron, currently at CAP, but you had been at the Department of Ed responsible for all of the federal student loan programs. What do you think of all these upstarts, to make a bad pun? You know, how are you excited? Where are you, from a student's point of view, what are the concerns?
Right, so some of them have already been addressed. I mean, this community, I think, is a great addition to the way that we're thinking about student loans and about the way that we invest in students. It really is much more than just a financial service or product that we're providing to them. But I worry a great deal about a couple of things. One is the federal student aid programs, and particularly the student loan program, is premised on, you know, shared risk, shared responsibility across the entire portfolio. And we have to recognize that all of us who are in this room who are U.S. taxpayers own the student loan bank in the United States today. And there's about $1 trillion outstanding that we have a beneficial interest in, and it does generate some revenue for the federal government. It's the minor part of it, but the point about the guaranteed benefits that students give up when they go into these products, they lose deferments, forbearances, income-based repayment, where payments are capped at 10% of discretionary income, and where the balance is forgiven after 20 years and 10 years if you're repaying the loan through service. And also, we all forget that that these products, the federal student loan programs, have the disability and death discharges, so that if you become permanently and totally disabled, your federal loan obligation goes away. If you die, your estate is no longer responsible for it. So, you know, depending on the structure of the various products in the marketplace, you may lose some of those benefits that are really critical to families as they look ahead and deal with student loan debt.
Great. So it's finally to Bill Bennett, former Secretary of Education. We're in California, so I can call him Bill. If we were in Washington, I'd have to say Mr. Secretary. Keep it informal. You know, you probably have forgotten more about this topic than I know. What's your take on these innovative models, you know, opportunity, and what are the challenges you see?
Well, first, I didn't direct anything like Dave. I just oversaw everything, which, you know, become secretary. They give you a hat and a flag and a microphone. You bark orders and hope somebody's listening for 4 years. And then you see. I'm very encouraged by this because Dave has talked about it, hinted at, the kinds of problems we're talking about in the current system. $1 trillion is real money. Sometimes to die is the single best thing you can do for yourself and your family in terms of, and the American taxpayer in terms of this debt. Not really, but it's very hard to escape. You could
Twitter is jumping up and down with that right now.
You could now say death, taxes, and your student loan. I mean, it's very hard to get away from these things. So it's very promising. I'd like to disaggregate and ask these guys who are starting very interesting things. Who are these students, and what are the questions you ask these students? One of the things I've tried to do, and I did in a recent book, was to say, before you decide to go to college, ask yourself certain questions. What are you going to study? Why are you going? Just going because everybody's going. Before you take on a huge burden of debt, have a pretty good idea what you're up to. Do you guys ask those questions? And then who are these students? Because if they're computer engineering majors at Stanford, bully for you. But, you know, that's a pretty safe bet. I want to know, as the lady who just interviewed me at Yahoo, I said, supposing you're a feminist studies journalism major. She said, I was. I said, oh, sorry, didn't mean to guess that. Are you going to bet on those folks too? Final question. Mr. Cagney, when you said about the alumni, isn't this what we have now at the Princetons and the Stanfords? You have such a great and supportive alumni, and the endowments are so huge because of this alum. You have, what is it, $2 million per student at Princeton or something? Isn't that exist already? What's the difference?
So I think the key is if you take a situation like Princeton, that's why they have almost no student loans, because their endowment effectively finances all students. So situations like Princeton, to a lesser extent, some of the others like a Middlebury or Williams, debt loads are very, very low because the endowment's relatively large, and they don't like their students incurring debt. I think you raise a couple of interesting points, and one of the ones is, what do we ask people? And we find ourselves in a situation where more often than not, we're addressing the symptom, not the cause. So we have people who come to us with $100,000 in debt at relatively high interest rates, and we find ourselves in a situation where sometimes we can help them by consolidating that down to a lower level, reducing their payments, and introducing them to a community that in places like Michigan or Berkeley, great schools, but the alumni network isn't necessarily as tight and strong, the endowment isn't necessarily as prominent. But what we do is we try to promote this concept and have been met with a lot of resistance of, we stole a little bit of this terminology from the government, it's called know before you owe. And the premise is that if you're going to take debt, someone should sit down and explain to you, okay, at this school, at this major, this is what your degree is worth. And this is how much you should be able to borrow to finance against that. So there's nothing wrong with being a feminist studies major at Grinnell, but you don't want to take $200,000 of debt out to finance that education because you're not going to be able to pay that off. So it's really accountability back to the schools of ensuring that they're transparent in the financial aid process, and they're not, and they're resistant to it. And they're resistant to it because they like to look at things as everything's equal. But
are you building in that data and that kind of awareness building into your model?
Yeah, so just like Dave could, we could as well tell you, based on your major and the school you went to, how much debt you could reasonably take down or what your income capabilities are. And this is data that's out there, it's not unknown. Obviously there's always idiosyncratic characteristics to the individual borrower, but the data's out there. And to us, the challenge is we're constantly addressing that symptom, and our assertions to try to address the cause have been met with a lot of resistance. And I'll add, we're a community-based marketplace, and the community is of alumni. And where this is important is in situations like death or disability, we do forgive loans, because the alum don't want to foreclose on someone and go take their assets when they have an unfortunate event like that. Just as with someone's unemployed, we don't call up and say we're going to take your car, we call up and say how can we help you get another job, because that's what the community wants. And that community-driven solution is very, very powerful. And it's a much deeper connection because it's both affinity and economic. So even in circumstances where there's a strong alumni network, you can build greater bonds through a structure like this.
Right.
What were you guys doing to educate, given broad levels of financial illiteracy in the country as a whole, and sometimes lack of transparency of data?
It's a huge issue. And understand that our target market, our mission statement, we want to help 1 million low-income, low-wealth students achieve a college education without debt. That has been our mission statement from day one. So I'm not from these neighborhoods, but I've learned a lot. The first thing we ask these students, do you know what you're getting into? There's a tremendous amount of missionary selling that goes into, and we don't use the word equity when we talk to the students. We have to explain ours is not an easily explained concept to them. So we spend a lot of time telling them what they're getting into. They actually have to take a test before they sign the contract. They have to take a test. We ask them to do a budget because the students we funded have graduated from the community college up in Santa Maria. It's called Allen Hancock. They've graduated. They're going on to years 3 and 4. We actually have them do a budget, including our financing, so that they really know what they're getting into. For a lot of these students, if not all of them, it's the first time they're going away from home and leaving family. So our conversations, and surprising to me, are very, very basic financial literacy issues.
Dave?
Our situation is pretty straightforward. When you are funded with private capital that expects returns, there has to be a connect between the amount of debt or the amount of capital somebody receives and the value of the degree and the extent to which that degree pays back. That is sort of a necessary requirement if it's going to be a private market solution. That requirement, for better or worse, doesn't exist when it's a public funded solution. So what you really have is a very big disconnect between the amount of debt somebody can accumulate to acquire a degree and the ability economically for that degree to service that debt and provide for a healthy living for that person and their family. And I think these are very different worlds, but in some sense, at least in our view, public funding of higher education could certainly benefit from market signals instead of saying every person going to any school for any degree in the world all has access to the same amount of debt, and there could be a lot more sort of market-driven signals and forces within that would make sure people are not put into the situation where they have $100,000 or more in debt and very unlikely to have job prospects able to service that debt.
So I guess stepping back, we kind of jumped into some of the different models. Like, I think the broader question is, and if you look at newspaper reports, et cetera, some would argue that the student loan issue, that we're in crisis, right? And so what, are we in crisis? Is the system fundamentally broken and needs to be fundamentally disrupted? David, do you want to?
Well, let me start with one of the points that's been made. I think this issue of consumer information is critical, and the administration has dealt with that with its college scorecard and the call for rating systems. But this issue of student loan debt and where we are is really troubling. If they'd put slide 1 on the screen, I see 2 problems with student loan debt. One is just the sheer size of it, but because it's federal's $1.3 trillion, $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion overall. 70% of undergraduates graduate with debt. Average debt of undergraduate, somebody coming with a BA, is 26.5. Doesn't sound horrible. What's on the screen is graduate student debt, which is a totally different problem, and it's dramatically changed just in the last 4 years. In 2008, the typical graduate with a master's in fine arts, picking on degrees, like my friend Bill did.
I wasn't saying there was anything wrong with it, as Seinfeld would say. Not that there's anything wrong with it.
Not that there's anything wrong with an master's in fine arts. But in 2008, the typical student graduated with a master's in fine arts with $16,000 in debt. Today, the median's $54,000, 230% increase. 90th percentile, that is to say, what the top 10% of borrowers are borrowing for an MFA is $133,000. That's up from $72,000 just 4 years ago. And that's the second slide if you want to change the slide. And that's an 85% increase. And so when we think about student loans today, we have to realize that we really have 2 it's a tale of two problems. One is the broad swath of undergraduates who are taking on debt, probably manageably. But at the graduate and professional student level, it's a big deal. The people getting doctorates in education, EDDs, almost 100% increase in the top debt takers. And PharmDs increasing by 68%. So it really fundamental change just in the last 4 years around graduate student debt that really troubles me.
Can I say something? I guess the older I get, the more cynical I may get, but I don't really have any faith in anybody's ability to fix this. I think there are only two people with skin in the game in this student lending game. Number one is the students who have the debt, and number two, the U.S. taxpayer. So bad news, I think it's going to blow up, and that's when the policymakers are really focused on it.
I think there's a couple of dynamics, and just very quick to the graduate student issue. Majority of the folks that we refinance are from graduate programs, and it's very clear what's happening. You've got a Grad Plus loan that effectively has no ceiling. So you're limited in how much you can borrow in the old direct program. They've renamed it now that they've modified it. But as an undergrad, your debt's capped. As a grad student, the school sets the amount based on the estimated cost of attendance, and that's why you've seen an explosion in that debt. And we have folks that come through with $300,000, $400,000 of grad school debt, and it's you know, very, very troubling to see that. And if you think about the ultimate accountability, the way the government's accounting for that debt, when they originate it, they discount it at a rate that's very close to the rate that the government borrows at, and it looks like a gain. But that gain doesn't materialize until that borrower actually pays back. And if you look at a lot of the universe out there, those repayment rates aren't going to be as high as I think were assumed.
What I was going to say is, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right, Mr. Will, about skin in the game. And it would be good to get the institutions to have some skin in the game. That's another dimension of this. I not entirely blame the federal government, even though I'm a good card-carrying conservative. I'm kind of sympathetic to the federal government's problem.
Tweet that.
Look, yeah, well, tweet that, yeah. Kind of sympathetic. Look what happened to the president when he said, so art history majors, beware, maybe you ought to take a few business courses. Boy, he had to back off that in 12 seconds. I'm guilty. I majored in philosophy, for God's sakes. You guys wouldn't give me a dime. I doubled down. I did a PhD in philosophy. And now I have an audience of cab drivers who are my philosophy students listening to my radio show, which is great. But one understands, when I was a graduate student getting one of those loans, I said, gee, it's all for the sciences. All the money's going to the sciences. Can we get anything? A society does need some philosophers. Maybe, I don't know, maybe. I'm not so sure now. Anyway, so I understand that. But the lying is at the institutional level, where, I mean, read catalog copy. One step to Milken University, next step the stars. I mean, they think if they go, and the parents think if they go, and put more people in the family to work, the thing is just going to be an incredible, you know, reward. When I did this little book, the thing that people reacted to most was not anything I said. I just reprinted the tables of return on investment for a number of institutions, the ROI. And the people, of course, who are at the bottom 80%, because there aren't that many institutions that give you a good return on investment, were furious just at the reprinting of this. Well, how about introducing these facts into the discussion?
You know, you can't go into McDonald's today without seeing a big sign that says that a Big Mac has 1,000 calories to it. And McDonald's doesn't have a lot of say in that. But it seems really clear that just making access to information easy for people, being able to see when you graduate from these degree programs, here's statistically what you're likely to earn, and make them informed borrowers. We don't actually need the schools to decide that to let their people borrow less. They just need to share the information with the borrowers in a very proactive manner, you know, before the decisions are made, before the hole is dug.
So, well, to that the question, we'll take this in a range of directions, but on the McDonald's example, that wasn't McDonald's altruistic, let's publish the data.
No. But,
so
I mean,
but what's the role of the federal government?
The university's presidents clearly hate anybody putting the value on a degree. Too bad, because you can't go ahead and charge somebody you know,
I
tens
agree.
or hundreds of
Yep.
thousands
Absolutely.
of dollars for something without somebody describing the economic
Is
value.
that a role
agree.
for the federal government to get in and to?
Absolutely.
The
As long as
federal-
they're funding loans.
That's what Wyden Rubio's about, I think.
Right. And in 2008, Congress passed a law that said that the federal government couldn't have a system to allow to calculate those, and that's exactly what Wyden Rubio was trying to overturn, and it is at the heart of the work that we did at the department around college scorecards. And the one thing we left blank was earnings, because unlike you all using private sector solutions for income, we wanted to use federal data, and
Well,
they
all ours
will.
comes. We can predict the earnings of anybody from any degree program in the United States. And guess what? Most of it comes from government data. So, thank you for the data. It's there. So it's not as if it's not a solvable problem from a data perspective.
So I want to come back to this concept of ROI for a second. When you said there are two stakeholders, the borrowers and the federal government, in the new emerging models, there are private investors who are stakeholders as well. So I'm interested in how you're presenting this to the investors that you're talking to, how you're positioning the returns on it. Is it a market rate return? What asset class are you benchmarking it to? Is it an impact investment in which people will give up some market rate return? And what's working with the people that are committing to your programs right now?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start off. So we effectively have to offer a market rate return. So there's definitely a social impact aspect that people appreciate, but it's not sufficient to subsidize the economics. Now, fortunately, there's an opportunity to offer very compelling economics, and we've been able to do that, but we have to do it in a very limited borrower set. So, a great example, the other day we had $36 million of loan applications come in a day. Of that, 15 million we could fund, 21 million we couldn't. And we couldn't fund the other 21 million because the capital markets aren't ready for that borrower. There was nothing wrong with them. Their FICO score wasn't high enough or their free cash flow wasn't high enough, but at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with that borrower, and they should be able to get an economic value proposition of refinancing. But we can't do that yet because the markets haven't opened. We've talked about the idea of leveraging a structure that's been used in the past to open up frozen asset-backed markets, which is TALF. I think that's an approach to take to facilitate opening these markets up and allowing more rapid refinancing through the private channel and more savings into the underlying borrowers. But those discussions are in infancy. So right now, we're limited to the best of borrowers. And it's frustrating because we've got folks that are absolutely creditworthy, can absolutely benefit from refinancing, that in any other market other than student lending, you'd be able to refinance that person in a viable way to give them some benefits and savings. But because it's student lending, we can't.
Anything to add on the investor side?
I'm the guy with the halo. Ours is a complete nonprofit. So, and by the way, my colleagues and I are everything related to this, architects, financiers. So this club I mentioned is actually borrowing money at 0%. And the hope of the investors is to get their money back through this income repayment mechanism over a 15-year period of time. So that was intentional. That was from day one, design it as a complete nonprofit, really to isolate the key issues and hope enough people agree that this is really good for the country at the end of the day.
So when I told people that I was coming down and doing this panel at Milken, within 60 seconds, every single conversation, a word kept cropping up, or a pair of words, indentured servitude, right? And people just naturally gravitated to that as, wait a minute, they like, and these are folks in the Valley that like disruptive innovation, right? So yeah, is that a real concern? Is that just a marketing challenge? How do you see this as an impediment as you guys look to move forward?
Well, in 5,000 years of lending, there's never been a particular affinity or love for lenders. People that provide money and sit back and wait while other people labor to pay it back. So that's sort of the background I think you all have to consider, which is lenders are never loved. But they do provide an important function. The notion of paying back as a fraction of your income versus a fixed interest rate clearly makes some people think indentured servitude. Our whole belief and the reason we founded the company was just the opposite, because the notion of paying back as you earn means you actually can do whatever you want. It's liberating in the sense of, if I want to go do something for 6 months that may not pay back a dime, that's okay. If I want to take a shot at something that has high risk and high return, but a high risk of failure, that's okay too. So in our view, it is liberating, but having said that, people hear, you know, you owe 3% back to this investment pool every month of some sort, they react. But I think anything sufficiently disruptive generates that type of reaction. If it was just, oh yes, thank you, that's, you know, it's not sufficiently disruptive, I don't think it's a bad thing.
No, and as somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about income-based repayment formulas going back to the 1990s, it always seemed to me to be something you had to worry about, this idea that it falls into that category of things that you call indentured servitude. And for me, the way that the federal programs have dealt with that is you always can opt to pay under a standard repayment plan. You don't have to repay under one of the income-based repayment plans. And so there's always been this need for some kind of safety valve, some relief valve to prevent that from becoming the predominant way that we deal with debt. And partly because, you know, in some of the legislative proposals that are floating around to make this more attractive to investors, there is a federal preemption of all state usury laws, which suggests that there is a real concern about this. And I appreciate, you know, the models that are trying to deliver this at no interest, because they deal with that problem in a very specific way that other kinds of market-based solutions don't lend themselves to.
So we keep coming back. Washington is a recurring theme, both as the largest incumbent as well as all the regulatory issues. If you guys had a magic wand and could make one change happen in Washington, and by the way, that strategy of a magic wand has about as much chance of working as any other strategy in Washington right now. If you could make one change, whether that's legislative or regulatory, what would that be?
Well, for me, the first thing I would deal with is this issue that Bill raised, which is how do you get institutions to have skin in the game? And a proposal we wrote at the Center for American Progress on refinancing student loan debt, we made a specific proposal in that regard. So I do think that there are ideas out there for ways to get skin in the game for institutions, so it isn't just the government or the investor pool or the student who is taking on all the risk.
Sean? Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
Well, it's funny you asked that question. It was one of the first questions I was asked. I realize I'm telling old stories like an old man, but it's appropriate. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do to improve American education? And I said I would get rid of puberty. And true enough, they said, just what we thought a conservative moralist would say. I said, but I'm not in favor of it, actually. I'm in favor of puberty, not in favor of getting rid of it. But I would say, yes, I would agree very much about skin in the game. I mean, some of the stories I could tell you of these institutions, which are taking taxpayer money and just at tuitions that are the tuition level of Harvard or higher, and not delivering anything of value that we know. But otherwise, be as encouraging as possible to programs like this. We don't know how this is going to come out. That's what's really interesting about this. And I think this is very, very exciting. I just add one other thing on the positive side. I love the notion of young people, millennials want to be entrepreneurs. This is such a California thing. Seen the new show Silicon Valley? Everybody who shows up says, I have an idea that'll change the world. Anyway, it's great. People also, I'm just kidding you, people also want to get married. They want to buy a house. They can't do any of this stuff. And they get discouraged, and they get really discouraged, and that's the really sad part of this. I love this notion of 6 months. You want to be a philosopher? Go be a philosopher. You want to do something else? I think that's very encouraging. So I'm encouraged by Wyden-Rubio, and it's about sort of scrutiny. Look over, look ahead, know before you go. This will require the institutions to come forward with information, which they will not like, because they regard themselves as special and anointed and smarter people than the rest of us. And why do they have to be called to account? They have PhDs after all.
And to clarify, what you're both saying is that obviously for-profit colleges and universities have come under intense scrutiny on comparable sets of issues. But why shouldn't that scrutiny be applicable to everyone?
It should be applicable to everybody. Now, they deserve a lot of it for profits. But one of the reasons they're under more scrutiny is they're for profit. Thus, this thing I hate, which is if you go to work for the government, your loan's forgiven. If you go to work for the evil private sector, you gotta pay.
I just want to say one thing. I think the notion of sort of a market-driven private sector focus on funding higher education is very limited in several ways. I mean, it is really at odds with the notion of providing maximum access to higher education because people can't afford to pay market rates, frankly. So I don't think this is about trying to privatize higher education finance because I don't think that's realistic. I do think it is about trying to inject market signals into even public-funded public-funded education, and that is a really hard thing to do, politically and programmatically and everything else. But that's the idea that I think would fundamentally, change the game a lot, is to inject real market signals, real pricing into finance, even though it may be coming from public sources, which I think it needs to.
So now with the magic wand, what specific change would you make to help affect that?
Well, realistically, the amount of debt somebody could take on to acquire a certain degree would be tied to the economics associated with that degree, and they would be that would provide an incentive for the universities to channel people into majors where they're going to have a strong financial outcome on the margin. Doesn't mean everybody has to be a computer science major. There's plenty of room for philosophers out there, but again, with the right economic conditions underneath it.
If you think about it, there's something very interesting in the system where you hear everyone talk about how we need more engineers. And you wonder, why does an engineer pay the same for their loan as a philosophy major right now? So we really need more engineers, and why not incent them, or why not tie the loan to the market opportunity for an engineer? And I think, just reiterating what everyone said, and this isn't a very interesting panel because we're all agreeing, it's like kumbaya up here, but
Damn you.
But the basic premise is, if I had a magic wand, it would go back to the financial literacy question, which is every time a student takes a loan out, the financial aid office should sit down and explain to them, this is your degree, here's the school you're in, here's what you can expect to earn, here's what you can reasonably borrow. The premise that we don't have that conversation is absolutely ridiculous, especially when it's taxpayer money on the hook, that none of those discussions happen right now.
Bob?
My magic wand, I think it's a magic wand maybe, is HR 4436, filed on April 9th, co-sponsored by Marco Rubio and Tom Petri, who's a Wisconsin Republican, to allow a legislative path to move forward to allow the income share arrangements to be acceptable from the federal standpoint. Currently, it's got a 0% chance of passage, but it's a recent bill moving through the system, HR 4436.
So we want to turn it open to questions. Before we do that, I want to do what I like to call the lightning round, in which we go through a targeted set of questions everybody's got to answer quickly. I model it off our dinner table conversation with my kids, in which we play this or that. Would you like a chocolate chip cookie or ice cream? You get to pick one or the other. You can't say both when I give you the choices. You can't ask clarifying questions like what kind of ice cream. And so we want to tie it to our presence in LA, so we'll make some movie references along the way, or music references. So first question is, not with 2020 hindsight, but 2020 foresight. If we go out to the year 2020, how many dollars are moving through these alternative platforms? So let's pick 5 billion as something like 5% of the current market. So 5 billion. Option A is dream on, or option B is easy like Sunday morning. Bob, you want to pick one?
Closer to the former.
Dream on.
Oh, I'm going with Lionel Richie.
I'm B.
Dream on.
Yeah, B.
Okay, so now we get some controversy going. Okay, let's keep it rolling. Okay, so Washington, we talked a little bit about the magic wand. How optimistic are you that Washington will help facilitate these markets? So Washington is a friend. Option A, friends with benefit, or B, scared straight. Well, you want to
Scared straight.
Scared straight.
Got to do
Yeah,
something.
I'm
Got to
B
do
as
something.
well.
Dave?
B, scared straight, no question.
Ditto.
Okay, that was optimistic. Great.
In the Catholic Church, we call it imperfect contrition.
Okay, the view of students. Is this an empowering and liberating? So option A, 12 years a slave, or option B, long walk to freedom. Mike, you want to start with this one?
B.
12 years a slave.
Well, long walk to freedom, yeah.
Dave?
Freedom. I'm for freedom, yes.
total freedom.
Fantastic. So with that, why don't we turn it over to questions for folks to ask the panel?
Hey, thank you very much for speaking today. A few questions. So, I mean, I would imagine you all are interested in scaling these human capital contracts, but to me that seems that, you know, there might be some institutional capital coming onto the sites. So if that is the case, I mean, how much is made up of kind of alumni lending on the site as opposed to institutional capital? And then do you see this affecting the community that you're creating either on a SoFi or an Upstart?
Sure. So I'll start. We rely on a decent amount of institutional capital. So I'd say roughly 20% of our capital base is alumni, 80% is institutional right now. And we're trying to build a greater alumni presence over time. But the institutional capital is fast and it can meet the need immediately. What we've done to ensure that we maintain the consistent thesis of this peer-to-peer association, you know, one thing you have to remember, when you take a loan from SoFi, you agree that if you default, it's actually transparent to all the alumni who invested in your loan. And so you're taking that accountability coming into the transaction. And we think there's a strong moral suasion, adverse selection, moral hazard component that comes out of that. So it's very important to us to maintain that. So
it's built into the microfinance world as well.
That's right, that's right. You don't want to default in your own community. And it's sort of the wall of shame. You don't want to be on the wall of shame. And we think that's very, and that's why we've had over 5,000 borrowers. If you look at government cohort default numbers, so when our borrowers borrowed from us versus when they went into repayment, we should have about 45 people in 90-day delinquency right now, which would foot with the government default rates. We have none. We've never had a 90-day delinquency. We've never had a default in the loan book. And we think that moral suasion plays a large part of that. But I think that what we try to do is maintain that every loan has alumni participation. And where this got very creative was last year. We did the first rated peer-to-peer securitization. The equity in that securitization was all alumni capital. And it was the first transaction of its kind, not just that it was a first rated peer-to-peer deal, but that it was a retail alumni base that took the first loss component of that transaction to maintain that thesis of connectivity to your community.
So an Upstart, the way it works, it's probably about 2/3 institutional capital, 1/3 individual. And the way it works in our system is we're Kickstarter-like, where somebody is actually raising the money, and an individual offers somebody, and it's actually matched sort of magically institutionally. And we think that's really good for all. First of all, it brings more liquidity to the platform, which is important for the borrower. And at the same time, the institutional dollar is actually following the retail dollar. The retail dollar are actual people who are making some evaluation, and they're also somebody who will, more often than not, establish a relationship and help that person over time. They may go on and invest in their company later. They may make an introduction to help them get a job. That happens every day on our platform. And the institutional investors aren't doing any of that, of course, but they are essentially following the individual investor. That has a really good effect. And we think that's the right balance all around. Is you need to have liquidity in a marketplace, but it's also really helpful that people aren't just getting money. They're actually getting a network of people that help them, you know, achieve what they're trying to
Mike, just to pick on the data for a second, the default data, well, that's wonderful. Realistically, at this point in its early days, it's hard to attribute how much to the community effects versus, as you pointed out, early days you get to pick off the cream of the crop.
Yeah, there's certainly an element of underwriting there as well, and we'll discover this over time. But I think that the important thing is we're looking at the data pari passu to the government cohort numbers. So it's not that we don't have enough history. It's when we did this loan, if we look at someone that went into repayment the exact same time and follow the government 3-year cohort default or 2-year cohort default numbers, we should be running at a 1% portfolio delinquency rate, and we run at a 0 rate. And so I think that in discussions with borrowers, there's multiple elements of this, and the alumni is a stick and a carrot, right? The stick is you don't want to default in your own community because you don't. It's something that you're very, very adverse to do. The carrot is if you end up losing your job, and as I mentioned earlier, we've had 28 folks who lost their jobs. We go and get them engaged in the community and get them reemployed quickly, and so we freeze their loan. We work with them to get reemployed in a way that's meaningful and an improvement for them, and you rely on the community to do that. So I think it is a valid statistic. I think in terms of is it underwriting or is it the moral suasion, I think it's a combination of both, and we'll discover more over time.
Is there any kind of model, and maybe this has already been covered, apologize if it has, but not a happening in the finance world where originators of loans have to hold on to a piece. And until there is a repayment or some other event, there's always recourse to them. Any idea of applying that to the education process, these for-profit institutions or the like?
So we hold first loss on, hold a first loss position on every loan we do.
But that's for you, not the, I'm talking about all the educational institutions.
Oh, yeah.
So in the proposal that we put out from the Center for American Progress, we said, what if an institution bought the bonds associated with their student loans, a share of it, a cohort default rate of it, or some fraction of that? And then the institution would get, if their students performed better, they defaulted at lower rates, graduated at higher rates, whatever metric, you'd give them a little carrot. If they did worse, they would take a haircut. It seemed to us that was a way to try to get the align the incentives of the institution to that of the federal government and the students. Nobody that I've talked to in Washington really has gravitated to that idea, but I will continue to promote it as long as I'm at the Center for American Progress, because I think it's time for us to do something like that.
And the schools don't like it, even if it's a good school. So we went to an endowment at a school with a default rate close to 0, and we asked them to be investors in their own loan program. And they were vehemently against it, not because of the economics, but they didn't want to be perceived as profiting from student lending to their student body. So even in this situation where you have very low cohort default rates, the schools themselves are very reticent to participate.
Let me ask another question while we're waiting for others. We're obviously focused on students, but these platforms provide potential financing into a range of things, including entrepreneurial ventures, et cetera. How much, your core focus is on students right now. How much are you explicitly looking at a broader set of opportunities and capitalization needs for these borrowers?
Well, about half the people on our platform today aren't, they are looking to go to a coding boot camp, which most people would derisively say is not a school at all. It's a place where you go for 10 weeks to learn how to write software. But they need $10,000 to do that because these aren't free. But they actually, in my mind, are a signal of what disruption really looks like. You start out as someone who can probably earn $40,000 to $50,000. You go through an intense 10-week or 12-week course and pay $10,000 or so. And at the other end, you are a qualified software engineer or some other sort of technical skill set that probably increases your salary potential by 50%. So do the ROI in that, and it's phenomenally attractive. This is very early, and these schools are blossoming all over the place. But this, to me, is actually some of the more interesting things happening, which is these are startups that don't know anything. They don't have access to federal loans at all because they're not accredited institutions. They're startups, frankly. They're not wed to any particular teaching method, so there are all sorts of experimentation going on what's the right way to do this. But so far, I think the early results are quite promising that there are different ways to give people the skills they need. And the idea of going, from the age of 18 to the age of 22 and saying, I have now learned everything I need to learn, I'm now ready to be employed the rest of my life, is actually maybe an old way to think about education. Education is something that needs to be acquired in bits and pieces through your whole life. And maybe we ought to think about, some of those types of things. That's
well, given the broader skills gap that we have in this country, do you ultimately see that as having larger potential? Because the relationship between the capital that goes up front and the benefit is far more direct and connected versus a 4-year university.
Sure, it's a bit of I view it as a bit of a chiropractor-like notion, because in the economy, these people are already out of college, right? They already, maybe they chose the wrong major and it was years ago, and they're trying to say, okay, what can I do now? So in some sense, these boot camps are kind of realigning the skill set of the workforce with the jobs that are out there and what people need, and that's good. It's also paired with the fact that there's other efforts going on to introduce coding and software development skills like that into K through 12 education and make it more commonplace, just because the economy is changing and the skill sets that people need are changing, and you need both changes in curricula and you also need something like this, places you can go if you want to get yourself realigned with where the lucrative jobs are out there.
We've had an interesting experience where we felt, in theory, if you were going to back someone in a student loan, why wouldn't you back them in a mortgage too? And what we found is there's actually a stronger affinity around the mortgage than there is in the student lending side. The idea of helping someone buy their first home versus helping someone pay for their education or pay their education loan off faster. And so our whole thesis has always been around using a community marketplace to build a disruptive solution in financial services on the broad level. And so we've very quietly been doing mortgages for our borrowers. We've done quite a few at this point, and other types of lending and solutions into our borrower community by just leveraging the same group of capital. The idea is keep the capital local, keep it where you care about it.
Sean, just as an aside, since we were born in the midst of the financial crisis, for example, there were a lot of displaced automobile workers, and we thought we would start a program around the retraining of displaced automobile workers. We didn't get very far, but that was a target market that we were looking at. Probably have a shorter contract, different kind of percentage return from the income, but it was a interesting target market, but we chose to focus on low-income students instead.
I feel like we've also done some MFA and philosophy bashing. I'm much more comfortable with lawyer bashing, so if people have questions that they'd like to tee up about bashing lawyers, I think we're better off. I do want to just...
They're bad credits.
Exactly. That's it.
I have both degrees, actually.
You know why you don't want to lend to a lawyer in law school? Because if they don't get, there's two jobs. You have public service and then that $165,000 associate job. If they don't get that $165,000 associate job, they'll default. Worse yet, if they're not employed, the worst thing you want is an unemployed litigator borrowing from you, because it's not a very fun borrower to have.
Can I make
See how much more fun the lawyer bashing is?
Can I make a general point?
Sure.
I mean, what Mike was saying shows you it's a large cultural problem you're dealing with. When profit is a shame, is a shameful thing. You don't want to admit you're making profit. I don't know how one explains the Harvard endowment then, or other endowments. But when the university doesn't want to get engaged in this, because they'd be embarrassed to be making a profit, even though they turn the profits over for the sake of their students and the sake of their faculty. This is exactly the same culture that when you make an argument about students ought to be looking at their college education in terms of what they're going to make when they're done. Any college president, most college presidents in the country would say this is the height of vulgarity, this is the height of barbarism. Well, I actually used to agree. I used to think the purpose of higher education was to save your soul and enlarge your mind, but we gave that up a long time ago. So we might as well make it so it's worth your time and your profit. But that is regarded as the height of vulgarity. That's the reduction of these higher truths to mere, material well-being, and that's the cultural challenge. And that's at the end, the culture is always what matters the most.
David, I want to go back to one question. Just quickly, income-based repayment, we mentioned it before. That addresses a lot of the same problems that we're talking about, but it is yet to take off in a meaningful way.
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, income-based repayment isn't for everybody. It's for people who can't afford a 10-year standard repayment option. And for somebody who came out of undergraduate with $26,000 in debt, they mostly can cover that using a 10-year plan, even for most of our college graduates today. So always viewed it as something that would be for a particular group of students who came out with too much debt, maybe went to be teachers or social workers and the like, and therefore don't have the earning potential, at least initially after graduation. And so it always, in my view, was going to fill a particular niche in the marketplace, and it has. And the fact that it hasn't exploded is a good thing, because I think as we see from the private solutions, we really do want to learn some more about these things before they take over the industry.
Tony?
Yeah, I'm curious. There's been a lot of good private activity, especially on the back end in the refinance market, and some really innovative things. I'm curious, with the increase in the role in the direct student lending, you've seen a retreat on the origination side from the private sector and a real consolidation. I'm curious if any of the panelists sees that as a healthy, sustainable thing, or will that ultimately cause more constraint in terms of access to higher education?
You should introduce our distinguished questioner.
So Tony Miller, a newbie to the education field, former deputy at the Department of Education.
Yeah, I think that you'll get more entrants in private lending this year because of the rate set that will happen this year. I think the rate set last year was at a very fortuitous time for a student borrower with the 10-year at 179, basically priced any private lender out of the market. There was no way they could viably go in and compete. This year, with the Treasury at 279, you will get some more competition in there. But I'm not sure. It's a good philosophical question. We debate about this all the time because we debate about whether we should do in-school lending or not. And the reason is the government offers up a set of protections that are extremely powerful that I think you need to be in a certain situation to be convinced enough you shouldn't take advantage of them. I think for 2 or 4 years of school paying another 100 basis points on a loan that's in deferral anyway, I'm not sure that it warrants taking a private loan out, with the exception of certain programs like MBA programs, for example, where you have a good predictability on your income and you can generate a meaningful economic savings by going private versus public.
Other folks?
My husband just mentioned the height of vulgarity. I'd like to talk about the height of exploitation. As someone who's run an inner city foundation for 25 years, and that is the minority student who's given a loan, who doesn't finish school, who still has that loan to pay off, so has no college degree. And I think Mr. Whalen at the end talked about a mentor, having mentors. One of the things that very wisely, because you were on our advisory council for our student scholarship program, is that our students had to come in every 6 months and we reviewed their grades. Their grades fell below a certain grade point, their scholarship. They did not get that scholarship for that particular semester. And it did help us talk to them about many students are not being guided well in the inner city and what to major in. You know, we have students who want to go into pre-med and they failed biology. We have students who say, I'd like to be I want to be a journalist. They're great, but their English scores are terrible. Their grades were terrible. That, to me, is the height of exploitation, is to loan money to someone whose dream is a college education without a support system, without someone saying, now wait a second, let's really analyze, do you need this? Why? What is your goal? And let's look at what your skill set is. Because otherwise, they're paying off a loan that they have absolutely no return on. And I just wondered, I mean, obviously there was a view or a for-profit. Do you determine that when you have this wonderful non-default thing? What are your criteria for, and how many truly disadvantaged students are you serving?
Sure. So I think you hit on I think a common thesis that we've talked about here on the panel today, which is just one, commensurating the cost of education with value. You're talking about appropriateness, which is a very, very slippery slope to get into. And you're talking about underwriting to the student. And the government's opted to take a particular view here, which is they don't underwrite to the student capabilities. So everyone is pari passu, everyone gets the loan. That's problematic, and it yields some very diverse performance on those loans. The unfortunate characteristic of those loans is they're non-dischargeable. Everyone talks about the private loans being non-dischargeable in bankruptcy as private education loans. Government loans are also non-dischargeable, and the government is a incredibly effective collector of defaulted loans. So on a present value basis, I think they claim 85 cents on the dollar on defaults. There are some people, not me, I will point out to our Department of Education friend, who would argue that the DOE is the largest predatory lender in the market, larger than any of the mortgage lenders, larger than B of A or Citi or anyone else, because of what they do. It's a very challenging dynamic. So this is why we're very tentative about where we go into in-school lending. And why we like to focus a lot of our efforts on refinancing, because that's when someone's come out of a program, they've graduated, they've gotten a job. Those are the two big reasons why they default, and it allows us to give them a very significant value proposition on the economic side because they've made it there. So I didn't answer your question other than it's a very challenging thing to deal with.
Would anybody else like to not answer the question?
No, I'd like to try to answer it. I last week I spoke at one of the accrediting agencies meetings, and I made the very point that in response to someone subjecting to my focus on graduation rates. And I said, when you enroll a student as an institution, you're making a commitment to that student that you're going to see them through to graduation. And in my view, if an institution is not doing that, isn't making that strong a commitment, that it's the exception that the student doesn't graduate, right? It's a rare occasion that students don't graduate, then there's something wrong with that institution. And we have way too many institutions in the United States, public, private, and for-profit. All, every sector has institutions that have graduation rates that are 0. And most of our accreditors accredit institutions that have graduation rates on time that are 0. And I don't think that's appropriate. And we need to, all of us, start to talk to our institutional leaders and say, this isn't acceptable. And I couldn't ever say that as a federal official, but I say it now, often and loudly.
I just want to add one point. I mean, I think, a few generations ago, college was not for everybody, right? It was sort of the thing where rich people sent their kids to have cerebral thoughts for 4 years, and it was not necessarily tied, what you learned there wasn't tied to your economics were already set. And at some point in time, it became an extension of high school, something, required to have a reasonable hope of prosperity and success in our economy. Yet it didn't actually change from those days. It's very rigid in its structure. Today, if you don't have a 4-year college degree, it's sort of looked down upon. Well, a 4-year college degree has an enormous amount of cost, no matter what the universities do, associated with it. And it is not the right path for everybody. So, but the accreditation process says this is what a university must look like if you want to have access to federal funding. Where actually there's probably 10 other forms of education that would be far better for different people who have different skill sets, different goals in life, different things they want to do, yet they are all, in effect, thrown off to the side. And we're sticking with a model that was invented a couple hundred years ago for another world.
That's a great way to end. I just got my red card saying we're out of time. They didn't give me the yellow. They went directly to red. So please join me in thanking our panelists for